I wasn't even invited to my own meeting. After arriving late to school, I stumbled into Mrs. Peterson's class. She welcomed me in and said she was glad I could make it, though it didn't take a genuine or a genius to sense her sarcasm. I was put down as tardy and breathed a sigh of relief that I didn't have to go down to the office and get things situated, which usually involved parental signatures and handwritten letters. I ended up having to take the test I was hoping I would be able to get out of, but, as expected, the answers breezed over me, leaving me with the assurance that I had passed it with remarkable honors. Mrs. Peterson had even said that I was excused from the test, since I had missed a portion of her class due to my scheduled counseling session with Miss Kendleton, but I politely refused, her pardoning as I realized my living and breathing answer book was ready and primed for the exam. This seemed to improve our scarce and shallow relationship, as Mrs. Peterson found my willingness to take the test a noble and just resolution for compensating my not-so-appropriate classroom behavior. As expected, Miss Kendleton came hunting for me through the middle school corridors, knowing which routes I would take, as she had carefully memorized my daily schedule, knowing where I should be at all times. When she found me, she waved me in with her pointer finger, and told me that she was going to have the meeting I had been dreading the entire day, though she didn't use those exact words. She also declared that I was not invited for the first portion of the meeting. She said that as soon as she was done speaking with my sister, she would like to bring me in. I nodded, despite hating the entire idea of it, as I knew my words would have no influence over the matter. Well, then again, I'm sure with enough effort and force I could make my words very convincing, but I was warned to refrain from such methods, and I would abide by that warning. I stood quietly as I followed her to the counseling office. It was strange seeing my sister in the school. She was completely out of place as she lacked any formal dress wear that would have indicated she was my designated guardian. Her face was already molded into a look of irritation, and her eyes drooped from the combination of sleep deprivation and the hard labors of her morning classes. Miss Kendleton didn't act surprised, but, like she did everything in this world, she carefully noted my sister's appearance and unfolded an array of stereotypical presumptions that further led down the line of my evident neglect. To further make matters worse, Miss Kendleton addressed my sister as Miss Kaon, and gestured for her to follow her into the meeting room, after she had specified that I'd be waiting outside. I didn't say anything to Chris, but she threw me a look as she walked into the meeting room that was very similar to the looks she had given me in the past, that meant nothing short of, "I am really going to get you back for this." I crashed down into a seat and looked off to my side at the hunchback secretary that was chewing a handful of hard candies like a desert camel. She was perched comfortably behind a desk layered in stacks of paper that were of no worry or concern to her at all. I had come to the realization that this was going to be a very long wait. Sighing aloud, I threw my feet onto the low table in front of me in an attempt to increase my level of comfort, and the secretary lowered her glasses to get a better look at what she was seeing. "Ahem. No feet on the table," she croaked, and I quickly lowered my legs. "It is too bad the father couldn't make it," I heard Miss Kendleton say to my sister before the conversation got quiet. She was already getting down to business, and I wanted to be able to hear what was being said about me, as anyone would naturally. After a few handfuls of jaw-crunching and crumb-spewing chews, the secretary would look up at me to make sure I wasn't doing anything I wasn't supposed to. That made it impossible for me to get any closer to the door without arousing suspicion. I sat back in the chair momentarily, trying to hear what I could, but the muffled conversations yielded nothing that was audibly understandable. Every once in a while I could hear Miss Kendleton's strict and uptight formal thoughts over how my sister was sitting, her hand placement on the tables, and other redundant and non-significant factors. I would close my eyes to enhance my ability to hear her inner thoughts, until the sudden and powerful urge to splurge into an M&M jar filled the hunger centers of my brain, and I shot my eyes open. The secretary had retrieved a bag of candies from her lower desk drawer, and she secretly tried to keep it out of view. "Stop eating." The hunched-over secretary paused for a moment, staring at the bag of M&Ms in her hands like a dying love. She was hungry, but was also overwhelmed by a compelling insistency to stop, and she began to curl her neck as her mind waged war with itself. She couldn't come to understand why she had stopped eating in the first place, and began to pry open the bag with a delicious anticipation for its consumption. She dug her hand into the bag, grabbing a pawful of M&Ms that spilled out across the carpeted floor, as though she had one and only one chance to get what she could out of that bag. She had the same eager effort to shovel them down her throat. She tilted her head back, orally funneling large quantities of the chocolate candies, as though she was leading a drinking game at some wild fraternity. Those M&Ms taste like sh... In rapid succession, she bent over and spat out the contents from her mouth into the trash next to her desk, wiping any remnants of the candy from her lips as though it possessed deadly properties. After raising the bag to her eyes, she lowered her glasses and briefly read over the contents of the bag, before winding her arm around like a softball pitch and slammed it down into the trash can. She reached for her bottle of water in dire desperation, when she realized it was empty. She hopped up and out of her desk, running off to another part of the office with an urgent need to wash out her mouth. After giggling to myself over the matter for a few good minutes, I realized I had wasted my one and only chance to eavesdrop into the conversation by conventional means. The secretary returned with several small cups of water in hand and a facial expression of great relief. Her snacking habits were put to a halt. Concentrating was a little easier now without the loud, obnoxious crunching of hard candies and the impulsive, desirable mindset of wanting to eat, which screamed for attention like a child in a clothing store. The curious and investigative conversations Miss Kendleton was having in the other room with my sister was a much quieter and less expulsive mental exchange, which took a little more effort on my part to hear things clearly. I sat back and tried to relax as best I could, which would have been a whole lot easier if I could have reclined my legs onto the conveniently placed table in front of me. Instead, closing my eyes and sinking into the armchair did just fine. The conversation in the other room grew louder, but it wasn't exactly the words being spoken, more the physical exchange of gestures and the roller coaster of emotional jousting that was trying to be kept in check. Everything seemed to originate from Miss Kendleton, and had it not have been for her opinionated effort to judge my sister, I would have never known Kristen was in the room. She was a blank, a shroud. Nothing resonated from her. I couldn't tell if she was even there. It was as though the school counselor was giving a conversation with herself and heard voices out of the corners of the room, and hallucinated the physical posture of a person in front of her. My attempt to find Kristen was so strong and empty-handed that I was almost convinced she had never entered the room in the first place. She was not anywhere to be found. My focus drew me in. The concentration I placed in my meditative state slowly had me forget the boundaries of my body. The world shook. Vibration took place. And soon enough, the body I had once learned to live within faded from me. Everything felt fuzzy, sounded strange, and light began to form as though I could see through a pair of eyes. Things were blurry, and appeared as though I was flying with giant speeds through the air. The sound was much the same, as though wind was blowing harsh currents past my head. As I gave into the sensations, my focus had grown, and things soon became clearer. I rose from the chair, surfing through air, quickly reaching for my necklace. I found I had no hands and remembered the strange occurrence I had before. There was no body. Spinning around the room, I took in my surroundings and watched as past images began to play out before me. Students, in the same awkward tension I had undergone in my first visit, slowly formed out of thin air and reenacted events that had occurred at a time earlier than now. They arrived at the front door to the office of a scary and formal counselor who pried through their personal lives to find what it was that made them so different. These students were confounded guilt, left in exile, drowned by a sense of loneliness and despair as the person before them prodded at their character with intrusive questions. This individual, who was designated to help me, only escalated the problem, as these children knew who they were. They knew how they had little friends, how school was a living hell for them, and how they could not excel at the sports and interests of others. Now they were on the chair of conviction, and if it wasn't made apparent before, they then had an official before them declaring it all to be true. Most of these souls reached out for death, wishing upon suicide. I tore myself from the images, falling back to the simple layout of the room. Every wall had millions of memories, tiny vibrations that had a story to tell. Each air particle transferred energy, a source of emotion that had been donated by every passing being. It was intense, and there was but too much to see. It threatened me with insanity, and I tried to stay within the lines of more simpler things. When the room reformed in front of me, I passed through it, ignoring the scenes that began to form before me, neglecting any apparition that took life. There was too much energy in the room, and I had to stay in this reality. The door to the meeting room was before me, and it remained closed, uninviting. I pushed through it, passing through its solid texture, as though it was nothing more than mist, and on the other side was my sister. Kristen was seated closest to the door, right in view of what I could see. She was in a seat similar to the one I was confined to outside a wooden-framed armchair that had a cushion concealed in fabric beneath the occupant. She was still and absent of the vibrations around the room. It was almost as though she was frozen in time, unresponsive to the life around her. She was vacant of the abundant energy that resonated with the harmony of passing beings. She appeared to be not part of this world. Kristen looked across the room at Miss Kendleton, who sat cross-legged with tight elbows, bracing a sheet of notes before her. She wore a suit jacket colored in metal gray and a matching set of dress pants that complemented her carefully selected footwear. Her hair was overgroomed into rigid rows that wouldn't dare part their formation, and her face was stern and absent of emotion, though she could not hide her feelings from me. "So the father doesn't play a significant role in Derek's life?" Miss Kendleton asked Kristen. Kristen dropped her shoulders in a sigh. "No, he really doesn't. He does what he can." Kristen looked as though she had already answered this question many times over. "I pretty much take care of Derek." "Do you help Derek at all when it comes to his homework or schoolwork?" "No, he never asks. He doesn't bring much home." Miss Kendleton shuffled in her seat. "That is where Derek's grades seem to be slipping. He doesn't appear interested in doing work outside of school, and as a result, his homework grade is rather low," Miss Kendleton inquired with a robotic monotone to her voice. Kristen just cocked her head in return. "This is rather peculiar, considering Derek's rather high test average in most classes," Miss Kendleton continued. "His English and math teacher, Mrs. Peterson, is on the assumption that Derek might be cheating on his tests, indicated by his answers, which are identical to a neighboring student." "And what am I supposed to do about that?" Kristen threw her hands into the air in distress. Strange colors would radiate from Miss Kendleton only briefly before they were called back to a neutral state. Every strange change and occurrence around her seemed to be forced back to normality, as though she was fighting with nature itself. Her formal training kept things in place, and the air around her would accelerate in movement before slowing to a stop. It was a display of control, her ability to keep her emotions in check. It was clear Kathy was annoyed by my sister's apathy and uncaring nature, but the moment the radiant glow around her subsided, she went on to propose the next subject. "Derek, in his short time here in Keller Middle School, has gotten into quite a few scuffles, involving violence and other such natures. Is there anything at home that might be inciting this kind of behavior?" Miss Kendleton waited for an answer from Kristen, who only nodded her head no. "Video games, maybe? Movies? Is his father, abusive at all?" "Nobody hits him," Kristen said, while rolling her eyes. Well, I couldn't say that was true. She never really all-out socked me, but there was a few times I really felt it. I didn't have to tell Miss Kendleton either, because her extensive training in reading the body seemed to have indicated the same conclusion. "In my short time with Derek, he has only showed an impatience and unwillingness to speak with me. It is almost as though he doesn't believe there is anything wrong with how he goes about things. Might I suggest looking into a family counselor?" "No. No!" My sister shouted aloud. The same thought I had in the room and its occupants froze in time. As though I had arms, I tried throwing them out before me in anger, and from that action the world rippled before me. My words cast it out from my view, and the currents and air slowly waved across the room as everything began to return to time. Miss Kendleton was taken aback by my sister's exclamation before her hair stood up as the rippling energy caressed her body, knocking her pens off the table and flipping her papers over. It was as though a gust of wind cast through the room, and everything was affected. Everything but my sister. She was a solid object, reflecting the wake back the way it had come, seemingly unhindered and without notice of the change that occurred in the room. Kathy, my so-called counselor, could have sworn she had heard me speak from within her mind. "Okay," Miss Kendleton said, quickly concluding the subject. That is understandable." She tried to rid the strange sensations that came over her. She began to pick up the papers that blew off the table and scuffled them into her hands, finding them all out of order, which placed her thoughts in a disgruntled mess. It is apparent to me that you are, quite frankly, just not interested in this meeting, Miss Keon," Kathy spoke with abstained aggravation. "There are things that I have to do. Like I said, I don't just care for Derek. I have to do school too," Kristen argued. All right. Miss Kendleton rose from her seat, putting her hand out for a dismissive handshake, which Kristen took up instantly. Then we'll resign for today. A tightening sensation was felt in my midsection, and it pulled at me like a string that was tied around my waist. I yielded to it, giving into its call, and it yanked me through the wall, back into the chair, and into the body where I once was before. It felt like I was waking up. The door opened from the meeting room, and my sister came out first, looking at me with the same look she gave me when first entering the room. Derek, I'll see you tonight, Kristen said, before she walked out of the office, without turning back to Miss Kendleton. Derek, can I speak with you? Asked Kathy, who held the office door open. I looked back at the door where my sister had left and appeared confused at her sudden departure. Miss Kendleton took notice of that. I am sorry about your sister, but she was on a strict timing schedule. We can chat now. I walked into the room. It was different from her office, but I knew this already, as I was already here. It was exactly as it appeared when I watched from the outside, or wherever I was, but the realism of what I had seen, quickly faded the moment I returned to my body. It was like it was all a dream, and I found myself doubting what I had saw. It was almost like a deja vu to walk into the room. How are things, Derek? Kathy began, as she always had. She tried to start anew, and attempted to dismiss the displeasure she had received from her exchange with my sister. Fine, I said, without much enthusiasm. We had been through this all before. Miss Kendleton took in a deep breath. What can you tell me about your mother? I began to sob. I wasn't going to be able to hold it back. It was a terrible subject for her to start on, and in her cute terminology, it was known as a wrong turn. I was still afflicted with the terrible memory of what I had seen in the night before, the cold, sinister words that were spoken to me, the prophetic visions that played before me. I remembered the terrible warning I was given, and I recalled what I had been told to do. I don't want to do this anymore. You don't want to do what anymore, Derek? Talk to you. I don't like it. I just don't want to do it. Derek, I just want to get to know you better. I know. That's the problem. You just can't. I can't let you do that. Why do you say that, Derek? Miss Kendleton was leaning over the table, her pen and paper on her lap. Her teeth were parting, and her jaws began to drop as she was daunted by what I was saying, and the tears that were swelling in my eyes. I am not supposed to talk to you, I admitted, looking down at my feet before. And who said that? Who told you that? My mother, I whispered without realizing what I had said, and a great coldness grew in the back of my head. Your mother? Miss Kendleton asked, looking off around the room. Isn't your mother... I'm leaving, I told her, and rose from my seat. I opened the door and ran out of the office as the growing frost climbed through my body. I couldn't talk about it anymore. I had to get away. Derek? Miss Kendleton ran out of the office and watched me disappear out into the corridor. She fell back into her chair the moment I had vanished from her sight, dropping the pen in her hand, and then broke every formal rule about how a lady should properly sit in a chair. Bewilderment dawned on her reality, and she came to realize that everything she had learned in the years she spent studying psychology could have never prepared her for this. Kathy picked up the sheet of notes off the table in front of her and tore them in half, letting the pieces fall gracefully to the floor.